Black Death didn't just kill people, it accidentally created the modern world. While historians focus on the death toll, they conveniently skip what happened next. The survivors didn't mourn and rebuild the same society. They did something so radical that it still shapes your life today. But you've never heard this story. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It accidentally created the biggest job market boom in human history. Well, if you can call half the workforce dying a boom. Between 1347 and 1351, this plague wiped out somewhere between 25 to 50% of Europe's entire population. As like every other person you know, just disappearing. Your neighbor Bob? Gone. The baker down the street? Gone. Half the people at Sunday Mass? You get the idea. But here's where it gets interesting, and historians love to skip this part because it sounds almost cruel to mention. The survivors? They suddenly had all the bargaining power in the world. Think about it this way. If your local McDonald's lost half its employees overnight, the remaining workers could basically name their price. Same thing happened in medieval Europe, except instead of flipping burgers, we're talking about farming, blacksmithing, and building cathedrals. Peasants who'd been scraping by for generations suddenly found themselves saying, "You want me to harvest your wheat? That'll cost you double what you paid my dead brother." And you know what? The lords had to pay it. They literally had no choice. The numbers are staggering when you really think about them. Some regions took over 150 years, that's 6 generations, just to get back to their pre-plague population levels. 6 generations. Your great-great-great-great-grandchildren would still be living in a half-empty world. But labor shortage does funny things to innovation. When you can't throw more people at a problem, you start getting creative. Farmers began experimenting with crop rotation, better plows, anything to squeeze more productivity out of fewer hands. It's like when your wife goes out of town and you discover you can actually cook. Necessity breeds innovation. The old feudal system started cracking like a dropped egg. Serfs weren't just accepting their lot anymore. Why should they? The lord down the road was offering better terms, and there was plenty of abandoned land to farm independently. Some villages became ghost towns practically overnight. Others saw an influx of survivors looking for fresh starts. The entire social order that had held Europe together for centuries was shifting faster than a teenager's mood. And here's the kicker. This massive population crash didn't just change who was working and for how much. It completely transformed what they could do with all that newly available land. But that's where things get really interesting. When half your neighbors vanish overnight, guess what happens to all their stuff? Exactly. It just sits there waiting for someone to claim it. The Black Death created the most bizarre real estate market crash in human history. But here's the kicker. It wasn't a crash for buyers. It was Christmas morning for anyone still breathing. Abandoned farms stretched for miles, empty houses dotted every village, and suddenly everyone could afford what their parents never dreamed of owning. Think about it this way. If half the people at a buffet disappeared, there'd be a whole lot more food for everyone else. That's precisely what happened with land across Europe. Rent prices plummeted faster than a rock off a cliff. Serfs who'd spent their entire lives working someone else's dirt could finally call a plot their own. But wait, it gets better. These weren't just tiny garden patches we're talking about. Entire estates sat empty, waiting for new owners. A peasant could walk onto land that once belonged to nobility and start farming it like he'd inherited a kingdom. The social ladder that had been carved in stone for centuries? Well, the plague took a sledgehammer to it. Smart survivors didn't just grab any old piece of land either. They got picky. Why settle for rocky soil when the fertile valley next door had no one left to work it? This pickiness led to something economists love: efficiency. People started choosing the best land for crops and converting the mediocre stuff into pastures for sheep and cattle. And here's where things get really interesting. That wool trade I mentioned, it exploded. Sheep don't need as much daily attention as crops, which worked perfectly for a world short on workers. Plus, wool was Europe's version of liquid gold. Everyone wanted it, and you could ship it anywhere. The ripple effects were enormous. Former serfs became landowners. Landowners became merchants. Merchants became wealthy enough to commission art and fund scholars. The whole economic food chain got reshuffled like a deck of cards. Some historians argue this land redistribution planted the first seeds of capitalism. When people can own property and build wealth, they start thinking differently about money, investment, and opportunity. Revolutionary stuff for the 1400s. But here's what really blew everyone's minds. Cities started growing again, and fast. While everyone expected rural areas to bounce back first, something completely unexpected was brewing in the urban centers that would change everything about how Europeans lived and worked. With fewer people crowding the streets, European cities transformed into something nobody expected: powerhouses of economic growth. Sounds backwards, right? Half empty should mean half dead. But here's the kicker: those surviving cities became magnets for opportunity. Recovery wasn't uniform, though. Some cities withered like forgotten fruit. Others, they exploded with new life, attracting traders and artisans like honey draws flies. The secret sauce was location and leadership. Cities positioned on trade routes or blessed with smart governance suddenly found themselves swimming in possibilities. Take Paris, for example. Streets that once echoed with emptiness gradually filled with the sounds of hammers, looms, and merchant negotiations. The labor shortage meant craftsmen could name their price. A blacksmith who previously scraped by could now afford apprentices and expand his workshop. Makes sense when you think about it. Less competition, more demand. But here's where it gets interesting. Entrepreneurship exploded. When half your shoemakers vanish overnight, someone's got to fill those gaps. Young people saw opportunities their grandparents never dreamed of. A baker's son could become a goldsmith. A farmer's daughter could run a textile operation. The rigid career paths of pre-plague Europe crumbled faster than stale bread. Between 1350 and 1500, numerous European cities didn't just recover, they swelled to unprecedented sizes. Venice became a trading empire. Florence bloomed into an artistic powerhouse. These weren't accidents. They were calculated transformations driven by necessity and ambition. Well, the urban hubs became something like medieval Silicon Valleys. Ideas bounced between guilds, workshops, and markets. Innovation wasn't just encouraged, it was essential for survival. A tanner might chat with a metalworker about new techniques, leading to breakthrough discoveries neither could achieve alone. The guild system, previously rigid as church doctrine, loosened up considerably. New trades emerged. Specialized services flourished. Someone realized they could make good money organizing other people's businesses. Sound familiar? Early management consulting, medieval style. And the weird part is how competition actually decreased while quality increased. With fewer producers, craftsmen could focus on excellence rather than churning out cheap goods. A furniture maker could spend weeks perfecting a single chair, knowing wealthy survivors would pay premium prices for superior craftsmanship. These urban centers became incubators for ideas that would reshape Europe. The Renaissance didn't just appear from thin air. It grew from these bustling post-plague cities where survivors mixed ambition with desperation. Then there's the cultural explosion that followed this urban rebirth. But that transformation deserves its own examination. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it accidentally created the perfect storm for one of history's greatest intellectual explosions. When half your neighbors are gone and traditional ways of thinking clearly didn't save anyone, what do? You start questioning everything. Here's what nobody talks about. All those empty monasteries and abandoned libraries suddenly became treasure troves. Monks who survived weren't just copying the same religious texts over and over anymore. They had time, lots of it, and access to ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts that had been collecting dust for centuries. But the real kicker? Money started flowing in weird directions. Before the plague, wealthy families spent their cash on land and feudal obligations. After losing half their relatives, survivors found themselves sitting on inheritance windfalls with nowhere traditional to spend it. What's a newly rich merchant supposed to do with all that gold? Commission art, apparently. And boy, did they ever. The surge in artistic patronage wasn't just about showing off, though let's be honest, it was partly that. These patrons were basically saying, life's short, death is everywhere, so let's create something beautiful while we can. It's like getting a terminal diagnosis and deciding to redecorate your entire house. Then there's the literacy boom that historians love to downplay. with fewer people competing for educational opportunities and more resources per person. Literacy rates started climbing among merchants and craftsmen, not just priests and nobles anymore. And then knowledge was democratizing faster than a medieval TikTok trend. Universities that survived the plague found themselves with smaller classes, but more resources per student. Oxford and Paris became intellectual pressure cookers. Students weren't just memorizing religious doctrine, they were debating, questioning, and developing new ideas about humanity's place in the world. The weirdest part? Death made people more interested in life. All that medieval obsession with the afterlife started shifting towards celebrating human achievement and potential. Artists began signing their work instead of staying anonymous. Writers started exploring individual human experiences rather than just religious themes. Florence became the poster child for this transformation. The city's population dropped by 60%, but the survivors were resourceful, wealthy, and suddenly very interested in funding scholars and artists. It was like winning the lottery in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. Terrible circumstances creating unexpected opportunities. This cultural awakening wasn't just about pretty paintings and fancy sculptures. It was rewiring how people thought about knowledge, authority, and human capability itself. But while artists and scholars were having their moment in the sun, something even more dramatic was brewing in the religious world. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it murdered trust in the church. For centuries, people believed their priests could intercede with God, that following religious law would protect them. Then half of Europe died anyway, and many of those priests. They fled faster than teenagers leaving a boring family dinner. Well, this created the biggest crisis of faith medieval Europe had ever seen. People started asking uncomfortable questions. If God's representatives on earth couldn't stop a plague, what good were they? Some folks turned to extreme measures. Enter the flagellants, religious fanatics who whipped themselves bloody in public, thinking self-torture would appease an angry God. Makes your worst midlife crisis look pretty tame, right? But the real shakeup came from ordinary people who decided they didn't need middlemen to talk to God. Radical groups like the Brethren of the Free Spirit claimed anyone could achieve divine union without priests or sacraments. And the church hierarchy absolutely hated this. Imagine McDonald's employees telling customers they could make better burgers at home. Then there's John Wycliffe in England, who had the audacity to suggest the Bible should be translated into English so common people could read it themselves. Revolutionary stuff. His followers, the Lollards, spread these dangerous ideas like wildfire. They questioned papal authority, criticized corrupt clergy, and argued that true Christians didn't need elaborate church ceremonies. And the weird part is, the church's response often made things worse. Instead of addressing legitimate concerns about corruption and incompetence, they doubled down on persecution. Heretics were burned, books were banned, and dissent was crushed with iron fists. This only convinced more people that something was seriously wrong with the institution. By the late 1400s, you had Jan Hus in Bohemia preaching similar reforms, inspiring the Hussite movement that would challenge Catholic authority for decades. The Cathars gained new followers. Various mystic movements flourished as people sought direct spiritual experiences outside traditional church structures. Makes sense, right? When your trusted authority fails spectacularly during humanity's darkest hour, people naturally look elsewhere for meaning and salvation. The church tried damage control, launching the Counter-Reformation and Inquisition, but the cat was already out of the bag. Seeds of doubt had been planted deep in European soil, watering themselves with every corrupt bishop and failed miracle. This religious upheaval didn't just challenge spiritual authority. It completely reshaped how people thought about knowledge, power, and individual rights. But here's where things get really interesting. While faith was crumbling, something unexpected was rising from the ashes that would change medicine forever. The Black Death forced people to get creative with staying alive, and honestly, some of their earlier cures were absolutely ridiculous. We're talking about physicians who thought bad air caused the plague, so they walked around with bird-like masks stuffed with herbs. Makes about as much sense as wearing a colander as a helmet, right? But here's where things get interesting. When half your population dies despite your best medical efforts, you start questioning everything. The survivors weren't about to trust the same doctors who prescribed drinking unicorn horn powder mixed with crushed pearls. Well, those lucky enough to afford such nonsense anyway. Fear became the greatest teacher. Venice, being a major trading port, watched ships arrive carrying more than just exotic goods. By 1377, they established the world's first organized quarantine system. Ships had to wait 40 days before unloading, 40 giorni, in Italian, which is literally where we get the word quarantine. Pretty clever for people who thought the earth was flat. Then there's the sanitation revolution that nobody talks about. Medieval cities before the plague were basically open sewers with buildings. People dumped chamber pots out their windows like they were watering plants. Charming, I know. But after watching entire neighborhoods get wiped out, survivors connected the dots between filth and disease faster than you'd expect. Communities started organizing waste removal systems. Some cities even hired official street cleaners. Imagine that being a job posting. Wanted brave soul to collect dead rats and human waste. Competitive pay, high mortality rate. The weird part is, it actually worked. Cities with better sanitation saw fewer recurring outbreaks. Medical schools began emphasizing observation over ancient texts. Doctors started keeping detailed records of symptoms and treatments, creating the earliest forms of clinical documentation. They still didn't understand germs, but they were learning to recognize patterns. Think of it like medieval detective work, except the criminal was invisible and the evidence kept killing people. The University of Montpellier became famous for training physicians who actually examined patients instead of just consulting star charts. Revolutionary stuff for the 14th century. These doctors began performing more dissections, slowly building anatomical knowledge that would prove crucial centuries later. But here's what really changed everything. Public health became everyone's responsibility, not just the wealthy elite's concern. Communities realized that disease doesn't respect social boundaries. A plague that starts in the poorest district doesn't politely stop at the rich neighborhood's gates. This collective health awareness would reshape how societies organized themselves in ways that went far beyond medicine. Speaking of reshaping society, wait until you see what happened to the entire economic system. The plague didn't just kill people, it murdered the entire medieval economy and forced something completely new to crawl out of the wreckage. What emerged would make your local chamber of commerce weep with joy. Before the Black Death, Europe ran on a simple system. Most people farmed. A few people owned land, and everyone else just tried not to starve. It was like a really boring board game where 90% of players were stuck being peasants forever. But when half the population vanished overnight, this ancient economic model collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Suddenly, survivors found themselves in an economic wonderland. With fewer mouths to feed and abandoned farms everywhere, food became cheaper than a clearance sale at Walmart. But here's where it gets interesting. People didn't just sit around getting fat on cheap grain. They started making things. Lots of things. Craft industries exploded across Europe like mushrooms after rain. Textile production became the new gold rush, with wool and cloth merchants raking in profits that would make modern CEOs jealous. Towns that had been sleepy agricultural outposts transformed into bustling manufacturing centers practically overnight. The really clever part? These weren't just local businesses selling to neighbors anymore. Trade routes that had been disrupted by mass death and social chaos gradually reopened, but now they carried different cargo. Instead of just raw materials moving around, finished goods, fancy fabrics, intricate metalwork, luxury items began flowing between cities and countries. Well, someone had to finance all this wheeling and dealing, right? Enter the bankers. Not the stuffy medieval moneylenders who charged outrageous interest and got excommunicated for their trouble, but actual sophisticated financial institutions. Credit systems developed that would make your modern credit card company nod with approval. Banking families like the Medici didn't just lend money. They created entire networks of financial services that stretched across continents. This wasn't just economic growth, it was economic revolution. The feudal system of you farm my land and I'll protect you from bandits started crumbling like a stale cookie. Instead, cash money became king. Land ownership mattered less than liquid assets and business connections. By the late 1400s, European cities hummed with commercial activity that would have been unimaginable before the plague. Markets buzzed with international traders. Craftsmen worked overtime filling orders from distant lands, and entrepreneurs seized opportunities faster than teenagers grabbing free pizza. But this economic transformation created an unexpected side effect that nobody saw coming. It completely revolutionized who held power in society, especially for one group that had been overlooked for centuries. Here's something historians usually gloss over. The Black Death accidentally became one of history's greatest equal opportunity employers. Well, sort of. When half your workforce disappears overnight, society doesn't get the luxury of being picky about who fills the gaps. Women suddenly found themselves running businesses, joining guilds, and taking over trades that had been boys' clubs for centuries. It's like musical chairs, except the music stopped and women realized they'd been standing the whole time for no good reason. Take the textile industry. Before the plague, women might spin wool at home for pocket change. After, they were running entire cloth operations, negotiating with merchants, and making real money. Some even became guild masters, a position that would have gotten them laughed out of town just decades earlier. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just temporary wartime jobs that disappeared when the men came home. Many of these women kept their positions because, frankly, they were good at them. The economy needed every capable hand it could get, and gender became less important than competence. European cities started seeing female brewers, bakers, and even blacksmiths. In London, women dominated the ale brewing trade so completely that alewife became a standard occupation. These weren't widows just keeping their husbands' shops running. These were entrepreneurs building their own enterprises from scratch. Then there's the money angle. Women who'd never controlled more than household spending money suddenly had real economic power. They could own property, sign contracts, and make business decisions. Some became so successful they employed men. Imagine that conversation at the medieval dinner table. The ripple effects were fascinating. Daughters started receiving different educations because parents realized their girls might need to run businesses someday. Marriage negotiations changed too, since women brought more than just dowries. They brought skills and earning potential. Of course, this wasn't exactly the feminist revolution. Society still expected women to be wives and mothers first. But necessity had cracked open a door that would never fully close again. These working women raised daughters who saw expanded possibilities, who raised granddaughters who pushed boundaries even further. The plague inadvertently proved something revolutionary. Women could handle men's work just fine when given the chance. This realization didn't disappear when the population recovered. It simmered beneath the surface, occasionally bubbling up in ways that would reshape European society for generations. What's truly remarkable is how this economic shift laid groundwork for changes that wouldn't fully bloom until centuries later.